Frantz Fanon was born in 1925 on the island of Martinique. At that time, Martinique was under French control. He served in the Free French Army during World War II, and he studied medicine and psychiatry in France at the University of Lyon. In 1952, at the age of 27, he published his first major work, which was called Black Skin, White Masks. That book focused on the structure and origins of anti-black racism. In 1953, he moved to Algeria and became the head of the psychiatry department at a hospital. At that time, Algeria was under French colonial authority, and Fanon experienced firsthand the ways that living under an oppressive colonial authority are damaging to the human spirit. In response, he broadened his analysis. And I'm going to paraphrase John Drabinski's excellent article about Fanon in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and say that Fanon's early works were about the dynamics of anti-black racism and the ways that anti-blackness was particularly damaging for colonized people. But after moving to Algeria, Fanon focused on harms of colonialism more broadly throughout the global South. Now, the most complete expression of these new ideas happened in Wretched of the Earth. Now, this video is the beginning of our unit on philosophy of activism, and there are two reasons why we're talking about Fanon. The first is that he was influential in shaping the thought of the leaders of the Black Power movement in the United States. For example, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, two founders of the Black Panther Party, conceived of their struggle as part of a larger struggle against colonialism, and they often framed intrusions of the U.S. government into their communities in ways that were similar to how one would frame the intrusions of a colonial power into a colony. So this is to say, they saw the police brutality perpetrated in their black communities in the 1970s, the beatings, the arbitrary arrests, and the shootings as relevantly similar to the ways that colonial powers oppress native populations. Now, Newton, Seale, and a lot of other members of the Black Power movement, including Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X, learned how to frame their struggle as an anti-colonial struggle directly from the writings of Frantz Fanon. Fanon didn't merely teach them how to frame their critiques of an unjust status quo, though. He also taught them how to build a better world. And what we sometimes forget, but we shouldn't forget, is that the Black Panther Party built free breakfast, free education, and free medical programs for their communities. And every single one of those programs was influenced or inspired by the writings of Fanon. So the first reason why you need to know about Fanon's work is that I want you to meet the person whose work was, in many ways, a philosophical source of much of the activism that took place in the United States during the 1970s. Now, the second reason why I want you to know about Fanon is that he provided a radically different perspective to the nonviolent principles that most of you have been taught. And in this video, I'm going to be focusing on his theory of violence in particular in the context of the struggle for social change. But before we can talk about Fanon's perspective on violence, we need to figure out what violence is. There's a considerable debate about how to define violence. On one end of the spectrum, we find wide definitions that include a variety of emotional harms unaccompanied by the application of physical force. At this end of the spectrum, all sorts of insults and other mean statements can be violent. On the other end of the spectrum, only harms to a person caused directly by physical force can count as violent. Now, both sides have considerations in favor of them and against them. Wide definitions are useful tools for pushing people to take emotional abuse more seriously. The idea here is that since we take violence seriously, reclassifying nasty insults as violent will push us to take those insults more seriously. Now, the problem with wide definitions is that they make it extremely hard to classify any protest as nonviolent. If mean words are violent, then all marches in which people shout F Trump or all cops are bastards are violent protests. It would be nice if we could classify hurtful statements as violence only when we disagree with them and not as violence when we agree with them, but that's hypocritical. So proponents of wide definitions need to ask themselves a question. Do you really want to accept a definition of violence that classifies nearly all protests, including marches where people merely hold signs and shout slogans, as violent? Trudy Gauvier's answer, she's a philosopher, her answer is no. According to her account, a necessary condition for violence is that physical force is used to hurt someone. Now, to be clear, Gauvier is not in any way diminishing the damage that we can inflict upon someone with our words. In fact, she can agree that we're sometimes harmed far more deeply by the words we hear than by the damage inflicted upon us through physical force. Instead, what she's saying is that there is an important distinction between using your words and punching someone in the face. Likewise, there's an important distinction between an insurrection where people beat each other up and a protest where slogans are chanted and signs are held. What she's suggesting is that we use the word violence in both cases to mark this distinction. Now, my reading of Fanon's text is that he is using Gauvier's narrow sense of violence when talking about the actions of resistance movements against colonialism. When he talks about outbreaks of violence, he's talking about people using weapons to maim and kill their oppressors. Now, this might be a little more controversial, but I also read him as using the narrow definition when discussing the ways that colonizers harm the colonized. So, for example, I'm going to read you a quotation. Capitalism, therefore, objectively colludes with the forces of violence that erupt in colonial territories. In that passage, he's discussing how capitalist exploitation and violence are interconnected and interrelated, but they're still distinct phenomena that can relate to one another. And to the best of my ability, I could not find any passages where I can't interpret them using the narrow definition, and so I'm going to be proceeding with the understanding that violence, for it to count as violence, must require the application of physical force. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Fanon's thoughts about violence. And I want to pose a question. Is it morally impermissible to engage in violence against one's oppressors? And I'm going to be considering three ways of arguing that the answer is no. And I'm going to be basing this off of Fanon's chapter on violence from Wretched of the Earth. These arguments are inspired by Fanon's text rather than literal presentations of his ideas, and although I don't know if Fanon would have accepted any of these arguments, I hope that he would agree that I'm approaching his work in the spirit of respect and admiration that it deserves. So our question is it morally impermissible to engage in violence against one's oppressors? And as I said, I'm going to be presenting three arguments that say that the answer is no. The first way is to argue that violence is a natural consequence of colonial oppression as opposed to a conscious choice. The second is to argue that violence is an effective tool for ending oppression. And the third is to argue that violence is an effective tool for restoring one's spirit. And we're going to present these in order. So let's start with the idea that violence is a natural consequence of colonial oppression as opposed to a conscious choice made by an individual. Consider the following argument. Premise 1. Violent responses to colonialism are social phenomena that no individual in particular can bring about or prevent, rather than actions caused by the choices that particular individuals are making. Premise 2. If no individual can bring something about or prevent it from happening, then no individual has done anything wrong when it happens. In conclusion, therefore, in the cases of violent responses to colonialism, no individual has done anything wrong when it happens. So Fanon's picture of anti-colonial violence often supports premise 1. Under colonialism, there are two distinct sectors. There's the sector of the colonizer and the sector of the colonized. The colonizer lives in a world where there are paved roads and advanced sanitation systems. In that world, people live with a sense of dignity. The victims of colonialism, on the other hand, are forced to live in dirty, degrading conditions where their sense of dignity is constantly under assault. They're beaten and they are killed, and their countries are plundered for their natural resources. Now, when repression gets bad enough, the people rise up and they fight back with violence. And I'm going to quote Fanon. From the moment national consciousness reaches an embryonic stage of development, it is reinforced by the bloodbath in the colonies, which signifies that between oppressors and oppressed. Force is the only solution. We should point out here that it is not the political parties who called for the armed insurrection or organized it. All these perpetrators of repression, all these acts committed out of fear, are not what the leaders wanted. End quote. So as Fanon puts the point, violent uprisings are undertaken by the community of colonized people together rather than consciously chosen by leaders or anybody else. And I want to get metaphysical for a second. A blizzard is not caused by any individual snowflake. A stampede is not caused by any individual buffalo. And the hardness of a diamond is not caused by any particular carbon atom. The properties of being a blizzard, a stampede, and hard are attributable to the collective rather than to any particular individual within the collective. And I'm asking you to consider violent uprisings in that light as well. So let's move on to premise 2. In ethics, we often refer to the idea that ought implies can. This is to say, if it's true that I ought to do something, then it must be true that I can do it. For example, I wasn't alive when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and for this reason I couldn't have prevented his assassination. For this reason, I am not subject to, nor was I ever subject to, a moral obligation to prevent his assassination. I wasn't there. On the other hand, I can take my dog to the vet when she is sick, and due to my special relationship with her, I am morally obligated to do so under those circumstances. When we understand violence in terms of an individual's choice to throw a rock, fire a gun, or swing a bat, we can ask about the moral permissibility of that act of violence. When someone comes into my house, I can choose whether to swing a baseball bat at them. Doing so is clearly morally impermissible if I've invited them in, or if they pose no threat to me. But doing so is probably morally permissible if they are an unexpected intruder who intends to harm me. But violent uprisings against oppression are social phenomena that emerge in response to oppression rather than an action performed by any individual in particular. And this brings us to our conclusion. It doesn't make any sense at all to say that violent responses to a colonial repression are wrong because there's no individual whom we can charge with a wrongdoing. Now, one way of responding to this argument is to note that the actions of individuals do play a role in making social phenomena like violent revolutions more likely. Perhaps every individual who attends a rally increases the probability of a violent response to oppression by 0.001%. And if that's true, then we can hold people morally responsible for increasing the probability of the social phenomenon of violence. And even if the argument is sound, at a minimum, we can still hold individuals responsible for the individual acts that they, in particular, perform while participating in violence. And so with that in mind, we're going to move on to the next argument. The next two arguments I'm going to consider are arguments for the conclusion that violence against colonial oppression is actually morally good. So let's begin with the simplest one. Violent responses to colonial repression are effective tools for ending it. And I'll formalize this argument as follows. Premise 1, violent uprisings against colonial oppression are effective for ending oppression. Premise 2, it is morally permissible to participate in anything that is effective for ending oppression. Conclusion, therefore, it is morally permissible to participate in violent uprisings against colonial oppression. Now, as stated, premise 1 is too strong. Although Fanon notes that uprisings against colonial powers have succeeded, there are also many examples of unsuccessful uprisings. So one that comes to mind is the Chilembwe uprising in present-day Malawi, which ended in 1915 with the execution of its leader and the execution and imprisonment of 400 and 300 revolutionaries, respectively. So it's just not the case that violent uprisings are always effective. Premise 2 is also clearly false. Detonating the United States' total supply of nuclear weapons would end oppression by ending all life on Earth itself. And so for this reason, we're going to reformulate the argument in a way that's a little more charitable as follows. Premise 1, violent uprisings against colonial oppression are sometimes the most effective ways of bringing about a society without oppression. Premise 2, it is morally permissible to participate in the most effective way of bringing about a society without oppression. And therefore, a conclusion, therefore, it is sometimes morally permissible to participate in violent uprisings against colonial oppression. All right, so for now, I'm going to assume the truth of premise 1. But note that we're going to return to it next week when we talk about strategic nonviolence. Well, let's move on to premise 2. Now, it's important to be mindful of how strong premise 2 is. What it says is that it is always permissible to participate in whatever method of fighting against oppression is the most effective means of creating a society in which oppression has been eliminated. If these means involve torture, murder, kidnapping, and whatever else, then they are still permissible. Now, the way I see it, we have three choices. One thing you can do is defend premise 2, and if you want to do this, I would invite you to work through the ethical theories we've covered in class and examine whether any of them supports it. The second thing you can do is to modify premise 2 to make it less severe in its recommendations. So perhaps, for example, there's a set of actions that one is never permitted to perform in the service of one's social goals, but that other than those, anything goes, as long as it's the most effective. And the third thing you can do is you can just reject the second premise, conclude that the argument is unsound, and move on. So finally, let's consider the argument that participating in violence restores one's spirit. Well, that was kind of vague, so I'm going to be a little bit more specific, actually a lot more specific. And we're going to begin with a quote from Fanon. So he goes, "At the individual level, violence is a cleansing force. It rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passive and despairing attitude. It emboldens them and restores their self-confidence." End of quote. Now, the idea is this. When a person rises up and kills their oppressor, that act emboldens them, restores their confidence, and washes away the dignitary harms inflicted upon them through their oppression. So let's again formalize this as an argument. Premise 1. Participating in violent uprisings against colonial oppression is an effective means of healing from the dignitary harms caused by oppression. Premise 2. It is morally permissible to participate in whatever is an effective means of healing from the dignitary harms caused by oppression. And conclusion, therefore, it is morally permissible to participate in violent uprisings against colonial oppression. Is premise 1 true? Well, Fanon was, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, a psychiatrist. And I'm in the habit of deferring to experts when they are speaking about their areas of expertise, so I'm just going to assume it's truth for the sake of argument. But I wouldn't blame you if you remained ambivalent about it. Regardless of what we say about premise 1, though, the truth of premise 2 is dubious at best. Violent uprisings against oppression do not simply inflict harms against the worst perpetrators of oppression. And as we're going to explore in a later reading, the innocent children and other family members of colonial regimes are sometimes murdered in horrific ways during uprisings of this nature. While I may be entitled to quite a lot in my quest for healing, it is just implausible to think that I'm entitled to inflict grievous harms on the innocent in that pursuit. For this reason, we are left at the same place where we were after considering the previous argument. You have 3 choices. You can try to find an ethical theory that defends premise 2 as written. You can revise premise 2 to make it more plausible and then try to defend that theory. Or you can abandon the argument and look for another way of defending violent uprisings against oppression. Now, at the end of this inquiry, I'm left with a couple of questions. On the one hand, it seems as though violent responses to oppression have some good-making features. They can play a role in ending oppression, and they can be a way for the oppressed to shake off the remnants of the dignitary harms that they experienced during their oppression. But on the other hand, it's not clear what is actually licensed by these potential benefits. What we need are guidelines that specify when and how it is morally permissible to participate in violent responses to oppression.